The ledger was 8 years old and had a water stain on the lower left corner from the winter the greenhouse roof let go. I had carried it to the attorney's office in a canvas tote I used for farmers' market runs, folded inside a cotton dishcloth. The way you carry something you have handled so many times the spine has softened. My mother was already seated when I came in. She had her reading glasses on the table in front of her, not on her face, and her hands were folded the way she folded them at church. She looked at the tote when I set it down. She did not ask what was in it. She never had any real role in the business, my mother said. She said it to the attorney the way you state a fact about weather. I had brought the ledger anyway. I set it on the table without a word and slid it toward him. He turned to page 41. Welcome back to channel, where the paperwork always remembers what the family tries to forget. The nursery had been my grandmother's idea, originally. She had put in the first 6 raised beds on the eastern slope of the property in 1987, growing perennials she sold out of the back of a station wagon at the Ferndale Grange Market every Saturday from May through September. By the time my mother inherited the land, 6.5 acres in Whatcom County, 30 minutes east of Bellingham on a 2-lane road that flooded every February, the beds had grown to 40 and the station wagon had been replaced by a cargo van with a name stenciled on the side in forest green, Halcyon Green Nursery. I started working there the summer I turned 19. That was not how my mother described it later. Later, she described it as me spending time out there, which was the same way she described the summer my cousin visited from Portland and spent 3 weeks reading on the porch. I was not reading on the porch. I was unloading 60-pound pallets of peat moss at 6 in the morning and replanting root-bound stock that had sat too long in the holding house because nobody had kept the rotation schedule. I learned a rotation schedule that summer. By the end of August, I had rewritten it and posted it on the inside of the holding house door on a laminated sheet I made at the Staples in Bellingham. My mother noticed the laminated sheet. "That's handy," she said. She did not ask who made it. The nursery had 2 part-time employees that first summer, a retired schoolteacher named Bev who came in Tuesday and Thursday mornings to handle the register, and a teenager from down the road named Caleb who mowed the grass paths between the display beds and occasionally loaded customer vehicles. Beyond that, the operation ran on my mother's presence and whatever I did, which was most things. I drove the van to pick up wholesale stock from the growers in Skagit Valley on the first Monday of every month. I handled the standing orders for the 2 landscaping companies that were our largest accounts. I answered the phone. I did not have a title. I did not have a salary. I had room and board in the small apartment above the equipment barn, a single room with a propane heater and windows that faced west, so the light was good in the afternoon, and a monthly cash payment my mother called an allowance, as though I were still in middle school. The first year, it was $800 a month. The second year she raised it to $950 and told me she had really stretched to do that. I thanked her. I let it sit. What I did not do in those first years was track anything. I did not track my hours. I did not track the market rate for what I was doing. Nursery Operations Manager was the closest job title I could find online, and the listings I saw were advertising salaries between $38,000 and $52,000 annually, depending on the size of the operation. I did not track the decisions I made that saved the business money or the ones that brought in new accounts. I was 20 years old, and I had grown up watching my mother run Halcyon Green the way her mother had run it, which was on instinct and handshakes and the general understanding that the family took care of the family. That understanding I would eventually learn was not mutual. The first cruelty beat happened so quietly, I almost missed it. It was a Sunday dinner in late October of my 3rd year working at the nursery, the off-season, after the last market weekend, when the van was backed into the barn and the display beds were covered in burlap for the frost. My mother had her sister Renata over and Renata's husband Dale, who had just retired from the county assessor's office and liked to talk about property values at the dinner table. The conversation moved to the nursery as it always did, and Renata asked how the season had gone. "Really well," my mother said. "I expanded the wholesale line this year, brought on 2 new landscaping accounts. I had brought on those accounts. I had cold called the second one, a commercial landscaping company based in Mount Vernon that serviced HOA properties across Skagit and Whatcom counties, after finding their listing in a regional trade directory I'd subscribed to with my own email address. The call had taken 3 weeks of follow-up. The first order was $4,200. I passed the bread basket to Dale and did not say anything. I let it sit. Renata asked if I was still out there helping, and my mother said yes, that it was nice to have the extra hands. Dale said that sounded like a good arrangement and reached for the butter. I was 22 years old. I had been running the nursery's daily operations for 3 seasons. I told myself it was a family business and families talked that way, and it didn't mean anything. I passed the salad bowl, and the moment moved on. The way moments do when you decide not to stop them. The ledger was my own idea. I want to say that plainly, because later my mother would suggest that I had been advised to start it by someone, a boyfriend, or a friend who was studying accounting, or some outside influence that had planted suspicion in me and turned a cooperative arrangement adversarial. None of that was true. I started the ledger because I have a particular kind of mind, the kind that itemizes, that keeps lists, that feels unsettled when things exist only in the air. I bought the ledger at the same Staples where I'd printed the laminated rotation schedule. It was a standard green accounting ledger, the kind with the ruled columns. Nothing special. I paid $6.49 for it. I brought it back to my apartment above the barn, and that same evening, sitting at the small table by the west windows with the propane heater clicking on and off in the corner, I started writing. I started at the beginning. I wrote down everything I could remember doing from my first summer. Not in a grievance-collecting way, not with any particular plan, but the way a person reconstructs a route on a map after they've already driven it, because the reconstruction makes you feel that the territory is real. I wrote down the rotation schedule. I wrote down the first Monday van runs to Skagit. I wrote down the 2 landscaping accounts I had landed and the revenue I estimated they had brought in. I wrote down the $800 and the $950 and the amount I calculated I had been paid over 3 years versus the amount I would have been paid at the low end of the operations manager salary range I'd found online. The difference, by the end of that first evening's accounting, was $47,318. I looked at that number for a long time. I was 22 years old and sitting alone in a room above a barn, and outside the window the burlap-covered beds ran down the slope in even rows in the dark. I closed the ledger. I put it in the bottom of the canvas tote I used for the farmer's market. I did not mention it to my mother. I did not mention it to anyone. 7 years is a long time to build a thing you do not own. I want to try to describe what those years actually looked like from the inside, because the story of a family business dispute can sound abstract. Figures on paper, a hearing room, documents passed across a table, and the truth is that it was almost entirely physical. It was early mornings when the holding house was so cold I could see my breath, and the furnace in the corner needed to be coaxed on with a flathead screwdriver in a specific way that only I knew, and the stock on the south wall had to be checked for mold before any customer arrived because the humidity gauge had been broken since the spring, and we kept putting off replacing it. It was driving a van in February on the flooded Tulane Road, the one that ran along the low edge of my mother's property and collected water from the field drainage, and learning exactly how slow you had to go before the engine would stall. It was Bev, the Tuesday through Thursday register woman, calling me instead of my mother when there was a question, because after 2 years it was simply understood that I was the one who knew. Bev retired in my 4th year. We had a small party for her in the barn, store-bought cake, the good coffee from the tin my mother kept for market weekends, and Bev hugged me at the end and said, "You keep this place running, you know that." She said it quietly, not in a toast, not so my mother could hear. I said thank you. The hug lasted 3 seconds, and then she went out to her car and drove away, and I went back to close up the register. I did not replace Bev with a hired employee. My mother said the budget didn't support it. What this meant in practice was that I absorbed Bev's Tuesday through Thursday hours on top of everything I was already doing, register, phones, customer floor, while continuing to handle the wholesale accounts, the van runs, and the growing maintenance backlog on the equipment. That spring I logged, and I did log it in the ledger, page by page, 214 hours between April and June alone, against a cash payment from my mother of $1,150 a month. The wholesale line was the part of the business that had changed most in those years. What had been 2 landscaping accounts when I cold called the Mount Vernon Company had grown to 9 by my 5th year, 8 landscaping contractors, and 1 commercial greenhouse operator in Linden who bought our overstocked perennials by the flat. I had built the pricing sheets for every account. I had negotiated the terms. When the Linden operator asked for net 45 payment terms instead of net 30, I countered at net 30 with a 2% discount for early payment, the way I'd read about in a small business guide I'd checked out from the Bellingham Public Library. He accepted. My mother did not know we had a 2% early payment discount in the Linden contract. I had not told her because the negotiation had happened during a week she was in Portland visiting Renata, and by the time she was back the contract was signed, and it seemed simpler to just run it. This was the way much of the business ran. That 5th year, decisions made by me in the moment because I was there, and she wasn't, filed away in my head or in the ledger, unreported because nothing had made reporting feel urgent yet. The ledger, by that point, was nearly full. I had moved through the original green accounting book and started a second one. The second ledger had a blue cover. I kept both of them in the canvas tote in the bottom drawer of the small dresser in my apartment above the barn, under a folded wool sweater that had belonged to my grandmother. The year the county sent the supplier audit request was my 6th year at Halcyon Green. I remember it precisely because it arrived on a Wednesday in March, a letter on county letterhead, addressed to Halcyon Green Nursery with no specific name attached, asking for documentation related to our pesticide purchasing records for the prior 3 years as part of a routine supplier compliance review. My mother was not home that Wednesday. She had a standing hair appointment in Ferndale on Wednesday mornings, and after the hair appointment, she typically had lunch with a woman named Gail she had gone to high school with, and she was rarely back before 2 in the afternoon. I opened the letter at the kitchen counter in the main house. I had a key, had always had a key, and read it twice and understood immediately what was needed. The pesticide records lived in a filing cabinet in the equipment barn, in a drawer labeled compliance in my mother's handwriting, though the filing inside it was entirely mine, because my mother had stopped touching that cabinet sometime in year 3 when she discovered I kept it current. I went to the barn, unlocked the cabinet, and pulled the prior 3 years of records. They were organized by purchase date, vendor, product name, EPA registration number, and application log. I had built the filing system from a template I'd found on the Washington State Department of Agriculture website. I called the county contact number on the letter and spoke to a woman named Teresa in the Agricultural Compliance Office. I told her I was calling from Halcyon Green, that I had the requested records, and asked whether she preferred that we submit by mail or if she had a portal. She said mail was fine and gave me the address. I asked if there were any specific line items she needed highlighted, and she said the purchasing logs for the prior 2 growing seasons would be the main focus. I told her I would have them to her by the end of the week. It took me 2 hours to prepare the submission packet. I formatted it the way the WSDA template suggested, indexed by year and product, with a cover sheet that listed the nursery's information and a brief summary of our purchasing process. I drove it to the post office in Ferndale that afternoon and sent it certified mail. When my mother came home at 2:15, she asked if there had been any mail. I told her there had been a county compliance letter and that I had handled it. She said, "Oh, good," and hung up her coat. She did not ask what the letter said. She did not ask what I had submitted. She walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on, and that was the end of it. Teresa from the county compliance office sent a follow-up letter 2 weeks later confirming receipt and closing out the review with no findings. The letter was addressed, again, to Halcyon Green Nursery. My mother kept it in a kitchen drawer with the other official correspondence. I do not know if she read it. I let it sit. She told me on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just come back from the monthly Skagit Valley run, the same first Monday pattern, shifted by a day because the Monday had been a holiday, and I had unloaded the van and was washing the road salt off my hands at the barn sink when I heard her come in behind me. She had that particular way of entering a room where she was already in the middle of her sentence before she reached you, so you caught the end of what she was saying and had to reconstruct the beginning. Meeting with Marcus on Thursday, she was saying. Marcus Vale was the estate and business attorney she had used since my grandmother's time. His office was in Bellingham, on a street 2 blocks from the waterfront, in a building with a green awning. I had been to his office twice before, once when my grandmother's will was probated, once when my mother had refinanced the property loan. Both times I had sat in a chair against the wall and listened. "What kind of meeting?" I said. I turned off the faucet and reached for the towel hanging on the nail by the sink. "He's helping me restructure the business." For the future. Estate planning. She was looking at the shelving along the far wall of the barn, the organized shelves, the labeled bins, the pegboard tool system I had installed the previous winter because I was tired of spending 20 minutes looking for the pruning shears. He needs some documentation from me about the business's assets and operations. Okay, I said. Do you need me to pull anything together? She looked back at me then. She had her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She did that when she wasn't sure she wanted to be seen clearly. The documentation is just the business entity, she said. You don't need to be at the meeting. I hung the towel back on the nail. I've been running the operations, I said. For 7 years. I know that. Her voice was patient. The patience was the worst part, the kind of patience that is really a wall dressed up as a courtesy. But the business is structured as my sole proprietorship. So the restructuring meeting is just about my assets. You'd just be sitting there. The barn smelled of peat and rust, and the cold road smell the vent always brought back. Outside, the western light was going flat and orange across the burlap rows. Okay, I said. I let it sit. Family. She left. I stood at the barn sink for a moment after the door closed. Then I went up to my apartment, opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, and took out both ledgers, the green one and the blue one. I set them on the table by the west window. I did not open them. I just left them there while I heated soup on the single burner and ate standing up looking out at the rows. The night before the meeting, she came to the barn apartment. This was unusual. In 7 years, she had come up those stairs, the exterior wooden stairs on the south side of the barn, perhaps a dozen times, and always for something practical, a check to sign, a piece of mail she hadn't understood, once when a pipe burst in the equipment room below and she needed me immediately. That evening she knocked at 8:15. I opened the door. She was wearing the blue cardigan she wore when she was trying to seem comfortable. She had a mug of tea in both hands, the way you carry something to show you aren't a threat. I just wanted to make sure things were clear between us, she said. About tomorrow. They're clear, I said. I know you've done a lot out here. She looked past me into the room. I saw her register the table, the 2 ledgers side by side under the lamp. Her eyes moved on. And I want you to know that the work isn't invisible to me. It's just that the legal structure is what it is. What is it? I said. It's my business, she said. My name. My liability. My tax filings. You've been compensated for the work you've done. She said the word compensated with a slight pause before it, the way you say a word you have rehearsed. Marcus is just formalizing things. Formalizing them how? I said. She looked into her mug. There'll be an LLC structure going forward. To protect the property. Whose name will be on the LLC? She looked up. Her hands tightened around the mug, a small thing, barely visible, but I had known her hands my whole life. It makes the most sense for it to be just mine, she said. For continuity. The staircase outside was dark. From down the slope I could hear the holding house vents running, the thermostat I had set to kick on at 38 degrees, the system I had maintained for 7 years. The sound had become part of what I heard at night the way traffic becomes part of what city people hear, below conscious thought. I'll see you in the morning, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite guilt, or maybe guilt processed through so many layers of self-justification that it came out looking like mild inconvenience. You understand it isn't personal, she said. I held the door. I did not say anything. She went down the stairs. I listened to her footsteps on the gravel, and then the sound of the main house door. I went back to the table. I opened the green ledger to the first page. I sat with it for a long time, the handwriting from 8 years ago, younger and more careful than mine now, the first entries about rotation schedules and van runs, the summer I'd arrived not knowing anything. I turned pages slowly. I did not close either ledger when I went to bed. I left them open on the table under the lamp, the way you leave something out because you don't trust yourself to reach for it in the dark. That I woke up before the alarm. This was not unusual. I had woken up before the alarm most mornings for 7 years because the holding house vents cycling on at dawn made a particular sound, a low mechanical sigh, then a steadying hum, that my body had learned to treat as a signal. I lay in the dark for a moment listening to it. The ledgers were still open on the table. I could see their pale pages in the gray light coming through the west windows, the lamp having clicked off on its timer sometime after midnight. I got up. I put water on the single burner. I stood at the window while it heated and looked down the slope at the burlap rows, which in the early light looked like something between a garden and a field and belonged entirely to neither. The frost had come in overnight, a light one, the kind that silvered the edges of things without damaging them, the kind that looked like care. I thought about the first winter I had set the holding house thermostat. I had been 20 years old, and I had asked my mother what temperature she kept it at, and she had said she usually just went by feel. I had looked up the optimal overwintering temperature for the rootstock we were holding. The range was 38 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on species, and I had set it to 38 and written the number on a strip of masking tape I stuck to the wall above the thermostat. The tape was still there. I had replaced it once when the adhesive gave out, but the number had not changed. The kettle began to rattle. I poured the water over the grounds in the small pour-over cone I kept on the counter and stood there while the coffee came through, watching the drip. I thought about my grandmother. She had built the first 6 beds on the eastern slope with her own hands. This was family fact, repeated enough times to have the texture of legend. But what was less often said was that she had also kept a notebook. I had found it in the barn after she died, in a shoebox on the top shelf of the compliance cabinet, behind a stack of old market receipts. The notebook was spiral-bound, its cover soft with age, and inside it she had recorded every plant variety she'd ever grown, with columns for germination rate, average sale price, and what she called repeat ask, whether customers came back for that plant the following season. The entries went back to 1989. I had kept that notebook. It was in the same bottom drawer as the ledgers, under the wool sweater. I did not know if my grandmother had intended anyone to find it. I did not know if she had thought of it as a business record or a personal one or something in between. What I knew was that when I read it, the careful handwriting, the columns, the decades of accumulated attention, I recognized the impulse behind it. The need to make the work legible. The understanding that the work would not make itself legible on its own. I finished the coffee. I rinsed the cup at the sink. I opened the bottom drawer and took out both ledgers and my grandmother's notebook and put them in the canvas tote with the cotton dishcloth folded over them, and I went downstairs to get ready to drive to Bellingham. The drive to Bellingham took 40 minutes on the Tulane Road, which was dry that morning, no flooding, which was not guaranteed in March. I passed the field that went underwater every February, the one I had learned to gauge by the height of the cattails along the drainage ditch, and it was only damp at the edges. I passed the turnoff for the Skagit Valley growers I had been driving to on the first Monday of every month for 7 years. I passed the Ferndale Grange building, which was closed and had a banner across the front about a spring quilt show. My mother's car was not in the lot when I pulled into the parking garage 2 blocks from Marcus Vale's office. I was 20 minutes early. I sat in the car for a moment with the canvas tote on the passenger seat, and then I got out and walked to the building with the green awning and went in. The receptionist told me Mr. Vale was running a few minutes behind and offered me coffee. I said no thank you. I sat in one of the chairs along the wall, the same chairs I had sat in twice before, against the same cream-colored wall, watching the same potted fern in the corner that had been there for as long as I could remember, and I set the canvas tote on my lap and put both hands on top of it. My mother arrived at 9:58, 2 minutes before the appointment. She was wearing the gray blazer she wore to anything she considered official. She saw me in the chair and her step slowed, just slightly, before she continued to the reception desk and gave her name. She sat in the chair 2 down from mine. Between us was a low table with a fan of magazines no one had touched. "I didn't know you were coming," she said. "I know," I said. She looked at the canvas tote. She looked away. The receptionist called us in at 10:02. Marcus Vale had the kind of office that had been the same for 30 years. Dark wood desk, bookshelves with matching law volumes, a single window looking onto the street below, the green awning visible at the bottom of the frame. He was in his late 60s, a careful man who spoke slowly and wrote things down. He had known my mother since before I was born. He shook my hand and said it was good to see me, and then looked at my mother with a mild question in his expression. "Nora wanted to come," my mother said. She sat down in the chair across from the desk. I sat in the second chair. beside her. The canvas tote went on the floor between my feet. "All right," Marcus said. He opened a folder on his desk. "So, we're here to discuss the proposed LLC conversion for Halcyon Green Nursery. Your mother has asked me to draft the formation documents with herself as sole member." He said it the way you state a procedural fact. He was looking at me when he finished saying it. "I've been the operations manager for 7 years," I said. "Unpaid, formally. The business has 9 wholesale accounts that I brought in and maintain. I'd like that to be part of the conversation." My mother's hands folded on her lap. "That's not really, Marcus. The arrangement has always been a family one. Nora has been compensated for her time. She was never had any real role in the business," she said. She said it to the attorney the way you state a fact about weather. "She's been helping out. The business decisions have always been mine." Marcus wrote something on his notepad. He asked her to clarify what she meant by business decisions. "The direction of the nursery," she said. "The accounts. The product line." "The 9 wholesale accounts," I said. "I can name them if that would help." I reached down. I took the canvas tote from the floor between my feet. I set it on my lap and reached in through the folded dishcloth and took out the green ledger and then the blue ledger. I laid them flat on the desk in front of Marcus Vale, side by side, green on the left, blue on the right. Then I reached back into the tote and took out my grandmother's notebook and laid it above them, centered. 8 years of operations records, I said. Labor hours, account development, compliance filings, equipment maintenance, purchasing decisions. And my grandmother's original growing records, which I've been using as the foundation for the current product selection. Marcus looked at the ledgers. He looked at my mother. He opened the green one to a page near the middle and read for a moment without speaking. "She never had any real role," my mother said again. Her voice was still even. "These are just," she kept notes. "That's not the same as running a business." Marcus turned to page 41. He read the column entries there. I knew what was on page 41. I had written it. The first year's labor hours, the gap calculation, the salary range comparison, dated and itemized, and then he set the ledger down and picked up his pen. "Mrs. Halcyon," he said, which was what he called her when he was being precise, "these appear to be substantive operational records. Before I draft any formation documents, I'd like to review them in full." He looked at me. "Would you be willing to leave these with me?" "Yes," I said. My mother was quiet. Her hands were still folded. Under the gray blazer, her shoulders had a particular set to them, the set they got when she had prepared for one version of an event and arrived at a different one. "These are her notes," my mother said. "They document the business," I said. "You were compensated. You had housing. You had your allowance every month." "I had $950 a month in year 2, I said. "The operations manager salary range for a nursery this size starts at $38,000 annually." "That's not. This was a family arrangement." "You told your sister I was just helping out," I said. "At the Sunday dinner in October. Dale was there. You said you'd expanded the wholesale line yourself." She looked at me. Something in her face shifted the way ice shifts on a lake. The surface holds, but the sound changes underneath. "I built this business," she said. "Your mother built it," I said. "I've been running it." Marcus set his pen down. He looked at both of us with the practiced patience of a man who had seen many versions of this conversation across many decades. "I think," he said, "that before we proceed with any formation documents, I need to review what's in these ledgers. And I'd suggest that both of you take some time before our next meeting." He looked at my mother directly. "The records Nora has provided may have implications for the LLC structure we were planning, specifically around contributed value and any potential equity claims. I want to be careful here." My mother stood up. "She was never had any real role," she said. Her voice had thinned slightly, still controlled, but thin the way paper thins when you folded it too many times at the same crease. "I don't know what she's been writing in those books, but the business is mine. My name. My tax filings. My liability." "Your liability," I said. "For 8 years of operations I ran." She looked at Marcus. She looked at me. She picked up her reading glasses from the desk. She had set them down when she sat, and put them in her blazer pocket. "I'd like to speak with you alone, Marcus," she said. "Of course," Marcus said. Nora, I'll be in touch after I've reviewed the materials. I stood up. I took the canvas tote. The dishcloth was still inside it, the cotton soft from years of use. I picked up my grandmother's notebook from the desk and held it for a moment, then set it back down with the ledgers. She can keep that too, I said. It belongs to the business. I walked to the door. My mother was already not looking at me. She had turned back to Marcus with her hands folded on the desk in front of her, the gray blazer squared, the reading glasses in her pocket, the posture of a woman reorienting herself to a changed room. At the door I stopped. You told me the work wasn't invisible to you, I said. I'm glad the ledger agrees. She did not turn around. I did not wait for her to. I walked out through the reception area, past the potted fern, and out through the building's front door, and onto the street under the green awning. The drive back took the same 40 minutes. I took the same road. The field by the drainage ditch was still only damp at the edges. The cattails were the same height. The Ferndale Grange banner about the quilt show was still there. I stopped at the barn before I went up to the apartment. I went through the side door and stood for a moment in the smell of it, peat and rust, and the faint diesel trace the van left when it sat, and I looked at the pegboard tool system I had installed on the far wall, the labeled bins, the shelves I had organized and reorganized over 7 winters. The pruning shears were on their hook. The humidity gauge that had been broken since spring of year 5 was still broken, a fact that had stopped bothering me sometime in year 6, and was now simply part of the texture of the barn. The way the water stain on the holding house floor was part of the texture of the holding house. I had fixed a lot of things in this barn. I had left the broken ones too, the ones my mother said were on her list because they stopped being urgent and became familiar. That is a particular kind of mistake, the kind you make slowly in increments, each one reasonable at the time. I took the van keys from the hook by the door and hung them back up again. I went upstairs. The ledgers were gone from the table. Of course, I had left them with Marcus. The table looked different without them. Larger, maybe, or just more like a table and less like a record of something. I sat down in the chair by the west window and looked out at the rows, the burlap covers, the frost-silvered slope running down to the road. Marcus called 4 days later. He said the ledgers documented a material contribution to the business's development that would need to be addressed before any LLC formation proceeded. He said the word addressed carefully, the way my mother had said compensated, but in his case the care meant something different. It meant the ledger had done what ledgers do, which is hold still and be legible while the people around them move. The restructuring took another 4 months. What came out of it was not everything I had calculated in those first pages. The $47,318 gap figure from year 3 had grown considerably by the time 8 years of contributed labor and account development were formally assessed, but it was documented, and it was acknowledged, and my name was on the LLC. My mother signed the final documents at Marcus's office on a Tuesday afternoon in July. I was not at that meeting. Marcus sent me a copy by email that evening with a brief note that said the filing had been submitted to the state. I was in the barn when the email came in, replacing a hinge on the equipment room door that had been loose for 2 seasons. I read the email on my phone, standing in the doorway with the screwdriver still in my hand. Then I put the phone in my pocket and finished the hinge. Here is what I want you to know. The green ledger cost $6.49. I bought it at a Staples in Bellingham on an ordinary afternoon in October, between replacing a broken hinge on the holding house door and making a grocery run, and I brought it home and sat at a small table by a west-facing window and started writing down what I had done. Not because I was building a case. Not because I was angry. Because I have a particular kind of mind, the kind that needs the work to exist somewhere outside of memory, somewhere stable and legible and still. My grandmother had the same mind. She kept her notebook for 30 years and never showed it to anyone, as far as I know, and yet every variety she tracked, every repeat ask she noted, every germination rate she recorded, it was all still there when I found it in the shoebox, perfectly useful, decades later. The work had made itself legible. It had just needed somewhere to live. The burlap comes off the beds in April. This year I ordered it replaced, new burlap, heavier weight, better fit for the root crowns on the newer stock we've been adding. It arrived in a flat box and I unfolded it on the barn floor, and cut it to size with the good scissors I keep on the third hook of the pegboard, and I carried it out to the beds in the early morning while the frost was still on the ground. The frost was the same as it always is, silvering the edges, the kind that looks like care. I kept the blue ledger. It's in the bottom drawer of the dresser, still, under my grandmother's sweater. I haven't needed it for anything, not yet. But I find it useful to know it's there. If you've been keeping records that no one else seems to notice, the quiet work, the kind that doesn't come with a title or a ceremony or anyone saying your name out loud in the right room, keep keeping them. The ledger remembers what the conversation forgets. And someday, someone will turn to the right page. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needed to hear it. It helps more than you know. I'm host name, and I'll see you in the next one.